Back in 1975, I was in Stockholm writing some piece of rubbish when I got a phone call from my agent asking me if I would like to adapt Peter Pan for some, as then, unheard musical. As the landlord was pushing for the rent, I said yes. I'd never read it. But by the time I landed at Heathrow, I had. And it had touched a sort of chord in me somewhere because I was in floods of tears for some reason. I then got involved in adapting Peter Pan for this musical, basically cutting it down to make room for these rather atrocious songs. The upside of it was that Mia Farrow was playing Peter, with whom I promptly fell in love. And in order to justify my existence on the set, I decided to become the Barrie expert and read up on Barrie. My mum had in fact pointed out the dedication to Peter Pan, in which Barrie himself, many years later, tells this extraordinary story in a rather enigmatic fashion of how he met this family and how he'd written the play for the 5 boys, who he numbered 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. And I could see that any dramatist could see that there was a wonderful story in here. So with the help of Sharon Good, who was the production secretary on this Peter Pan, I started moonlighting and writing up an outline. Also encouraged by a friend of mine, Richard Longcrane, who at that point had his eye on possibly directing it. Initially, I thought of it as a 90-minute film, probably for television, since it wasn't particularly commercial. But it was then that Sharon got in touch with the last surviving lost boy, Nico Davies, and we then entered on this 3-year correspondence, meetings. The reason I did it for television rather than as a film was because A, it didn't seem like a particularly commercial story, and secondly, and more importantly, once I'd met with Nico and realised there was this vast amount of material that no one knew about, it was going to take a good deal longer than 90 minutes to tell the full story if it wasn't to become oversimplified and one-dimensional in terms of Barrie as a character. If you try and tell the story in 90 minutes, you have 2 options. Either you simplify Barrie's character, or, judged out of context, you get the wrong idea about his relationship with these 5 boys. I felt that it needed the full 4.5 hours to tell this extremely complex emotional story without people jumping to the wrong idea. Initially, I was prepared to sacrifice a lot of historical truth for the sake of drama, especially when I was still thinking of it for 90 minutes. There were 5 boys. I was thinking maybe one should reduce it to 4. The time frame, which is nearly 30 years, which is very complicated when you're dealing with 5 kids who grow up. So for every boy, you need 4 or 5 different actors. I was going to take this license, but once I had the full 4.5 hours, I really tried to use what actually happened and what was actually said. I can tell from letters and reminiscences, and I did a lot of interviews with people who were around at the time, and wherever possible to turn this historical truth into a dramatic truth and not to take dramatic license. Of course, there were a few instances where this was unavoidable. For instance, I have here we use this in the television. This is Barrie's last letter to George, the one who was killed on the Western Front in 1915. And in that last letter, he said, "My dear George, I don't know when news from quite near you may reach you, perhaps later than we get it, but we've just heard that your Uncle Guy has been killed. He was a soldier by profession and had reached a time of life when the best things are to come to one, if they're to come at all. And he had no children, which is, after all, the best reason for caring to live on after the sun has set. And these are things to remember now." It's a very beautiful letter. I wanted to use the letter, but this Uncle Guy was not a character, whereas Charles Frohman was a character. Charles Frohman was the producer of Peter Pan, who a year after George was killed drowned on the Lusitania. No, not a year, it was about a couple of months later, drowned on the Lusitania. So in the script, I used virtually the same letter and just adapted it, so it became My dear George, we've just heard that Mr. Frohman was among those drowned in the Lusitania outrage. He'd reached a time of life when the best things have come to one, if they're to come at all, and he had no children, which happened to be true of Frohman. So as an example, that's how one bent the historical truth. It's usually, largely, a matter of turning three characters into one. All the scenes with the children I found very easy to write. I was also determined to make them work because my producer, Louis Marks, to whom all praise, incidentally, had said, of course, it would make their life a lot easier if we could reduce the number of scenes involving underage children to an absolute minimum. And I said that was impossible because the whole core of the piece was to do with Barrie's relationship with these children, and that's what I wanted to explore. So he said, fine. And those, in fact, were the scenes that almost wrote themselves. I had a fair amount of primary source material in the form of David Putnam's son, Sasha, who was around at the time, was about 8. So I used to pinch some of his dialogue and use it in the television, because of course those are scenes that have not been recorded, so I just had to invent them. I think the happiest scene in terms of writing it and translating it to the screen was one with Barrie and Michael when they're in a hotel in Switzerland playing drafts. Very long scene, beautifully played by both Ian and the boy Alexander Buss, who played Michael at that age. The hardest scene, usually involving adults, the hardest scene was a sequence that we became known as the divorce scenes. Initially I wrote one scene in which Barrie finds out that his wife Mary Barrie is having an affair with this young writer Gilbert Cannon, and he confronts her and she says, yes, it's true and I want a divorce. And Barrie kind of hummed and I mean, he was mortified, not least by the fact that he didn't want a public scandal. In the end, it's always the dark side of characters that I find the most interesting, or their faults rather than their virtues. So I rather like this fact that this was sort of high on his list of priorities, not to have a public scandal. At any rate, I tried to condense it into this one scene. Louis Marks, who was incredibly encouraging all the way through this 2-year process of writing, felt that one should try and do it. It needed more than one scene. It maybe needed 3 scenes. So I went back, rewrote it for about the 3rd time, and this time it was in these 3 scenes, and I think he was quite right. The first scene is where Barrie is appalled and confronts Mary Cannon. The second time, or Mary Barrie as she was then cut, and there's a second scene a few hours later where he realizes it was all his fault, and of course she should find happiness in Gilbert. And then the 3rd scene, he changes his mind again, and he's saying, no, you can't go through with it because of the scandal. The hardest part about The Lost Boys, from my point of view, was having spent 3 years writing it, researching it, creating it in my mind's eye, even when they come out of the room left or right, or where somebody's standing or looking, is to hand it over to a director. At that point I hadn't directed anything myself, and because in those days the BBC had a very organised hierarchy, and they used staff directors, staff producers, staff lighting cameramen, everything was staff. I was the only outsider. I knew it from the beginning that I couldn't direct it myself because of this system, and so it was difficult. To give Rodney Bennett his credit, he was the director, and he only came on at the last moment. He was very conciliatory and very tolerant of me hanging around on the set, basically making a total pain in the neck of myself. And as Louis Marks once said, I remember very well in the corridor at the BBC, say, you're behaving like a spoilt child. And I said, yes, I've been nursing this thing for 3 years and I'm not about to see it go up in smoke. So even with Sam Barkley, the lighting cameraman, I remember looking at the set of Adelphi Terrace. This was being shot at the BBC. I should say at this point that all the exterior scenes in those days were shot on 16mm film with a completely different crew, whereas the interiors were shot with 5 cameras on sets built up at Television Centre. The Barrie's study in the Adelphi had been faithfully reproduced from the original photographs, right down to original paintings hanging on the wall, which we borrowed from Nico. But looking at it on the monitor, it looked like the place had a skylight. because there was light bouncing off the top of Ian's head. So I said to Sam Barkley, sort of in the break, it looks terribly bright in there, you know. Isn't there something that one could do about it? And he said, well, we could just slide this master switch. And he just slid the switch like that. I said, oh, that's perfect. That's exactly right. So he said, okay, we'll fix it there. I got a bollocking a few hours later for having interfered in the lighting department, but I got my way, and Sam Barkley later picked up the BAFTA award. So Ian Holm had always been in my mind to play Barrie, because many years earlier I'd worked for Stanley Kubrick. After 2001 I went on to work on his aborted Napoleon, and my mother had seen Ian in the Wars of the Roses down at the RSC and had suggested him to play Napoleon, so I passed on the suggestion to Kubrick. The film never happened, but this was, whatever, 5 or 6 years later, and Ian was very much in my mind. He was the right height, he was, in a sense, was Barrie. Nico was involved really at all stages of the production, to the extent that once I'd made contact with him, or once Sharon had made contact with him, and we went down to see him for lunch and started this correspondence that went on for the better part of a year. I think it was over 600 letters we exchanged, as well as going down, interviewing him, tape recording him and the rest of it. And I would send him the drafts of the script, and he was always very good. He didn't interfere. He would just say, I think Uncle Jim would have said this rather than that kind of thing. Then when we were about to shoot in January 1978, Nico, who suffered from emphysema at the time, so the BBC sent a car down to Kent to pick him up with his wife. And they came up to Broadcasting House, and we spent the whole morning with the cast and the crew firing off questions, all of which I have on tape and are now on the Barrie website. In anything you write or make, you tend to see the things that went wrong rather than the things that went right. And watching it unfold, there were a lot of things that, from my point of view, weren't right. Some of the casting wasn't how I would have casted it. Minor parts, but nevertheless, they grated. I got my way with a couple of the parts and managed to get two of them recast. But after that, I'd used up my tokens, so to speak, of interference. And so I tended to focus on these negative aspects. When I saw it at BAFTA, they had a screening for about 500 people, and everyone was looking at the huge big screen, and then realised they, of course, had to watch this on these tiny pod monitors that were lining either side of the hall. I'd been up all night working on another script, and this was its first showing, certainly public showing. And I think it was after part 2, I went into the men's room, and I was standing next to a man who was actually sobbing. And then I thought, okay, maybe we created more right than wrong. I was, of course, always knocked out by Ian's performance. Ian, to me, as Barrie, made it from start to finish. But there were also some other fabulous performances. Anna Cropper, for instance, who plays Mary Hodgson. She got into her own separate correspondence with Nico. So did Ann Bell, who plays Sylvia. And I think Tim Pickett-Smith also wrote to Nico. Nico was an inveterate letter writer, and nothing was too much trouble. He loved it. I think it made, his daughter told me that it sort of made the last years of his life. In the course of researching the Barrie story, and in particular when down in Kent with Nico, I found, or he found, and would unearth all these letters and original photographs which had never seen the light of day. And I felt to some extent that I owed it to Nico to tell the story as it happened rather than as I dramatised it. The television took me nearly 3 years to write. The book actually I wrote in 3 months because it was all up here anyway, and I just had to, I had a contract with Constable to deliver it on a certain date, and I just had to pound away at the typewriter for 3 months and turn it in. And that is the true story, if you like. And I tried to create it in a different way and with a different kind of artistry. Sounds pompous, but more like a documentary. allowing the dramatist person and I to tell their own story rather than me interfering too much. Whereas the television was my take on the subject. Peter Pan was Barrie's dream child, to the extent that a few years earlier, in 1902, he'd written a book called The Little White Bird, in which Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens appears and was later republished as a separate book with Arthur Rackham's illustrations. This was before he'd written the play. And it's an adult story about a humorous lonely old bachelor who falls in love with a married woman and decides to exercise the Danish proverb, he who takes a child by the hand takes the mother by the heart. And so sets out to win over this small boy, who in the novel is called David and who in reality was George, just as the mother in the book is Mary, but in reality was Sylvia Llewellyn-Davies. But during the course of this story, he fantasizes about having a child of his own, whom he fondly calls Timothy, and he refers to him as his dream child. 2 years later, when he wrote Peter Pan, I believe that character was Timothy, was the child that he himself could never have, rather than Barrie himself. This question about whether Barrie was a paedophile, either a closet paedophile, a suppressed paedophile, whatever, is a very hard question to answer. Nico would have answered it very simply. I don't believe, as he said, that Uncle Jim ever felt any stirrings in the undergrowth for anyone, man, woman or child, not to mention dog. Probably that sums it up. Barrie was impotent, it's fairly clear. That's why his marriage broke down, that's why he couldn't have children. That was, if you like, the tragedy of his life. Had he not been impotent, I think he would have probably been a womanizer. He was always falling in love with his leading ladies across the stage lights. And the suggestion that he was in some way paedophilic with these boys doesn't really stand up to close examination, because if that was the case, he would have lost interest in them as they grew up, just as Lewis Carroll lost interest in his child friends. As he wrote, they ceased to interest me once the river meets the sea. With Barrie, it was the opposite. If anything, the relationships intensified, both with George and with Michael in particular, but all of them. He kept up the relationship, not simply because he was a guardian, but because he was effectively he was Uncle Jim. The seeds of Peter Pan, without question, lie in his own childhood. When he was 6 years old, his older brother David, who was 12, was killed in a skating accident. And David was his mother's favourite child, and she took to her bed for a year and a day. And it was Barrie's sister who told him to go in and remind the mother that she still had another boy. I in fact dramatised this in The Lost Boys. It was the prologue to the whole thing, which never got shot. It's a pity, in my opinion, but it's still in the script, which is also on the website. But in that early experience at the age of 6, in trying to comfort his mother, he promised her that he would replace the dead brother, and she said, but you can never do that, because one day you'll grow up and become a man, whereas David will stay a boy forever, because he was 12 when he died. As Barrie then wrote in the book he wrote about his mother, nothing much happens to us after we're 12. Well, this seed idea, which was on the back burner of his mind for the next 30, 40 years, although it turns up in all sorts of things that he wrote before Peter Pan, especially in a novel called Tommy and Grizzle, which is about a writer who comes up with the idea of writing a story about a boy who never grows up. But that was a tragic story. The writer winds up committing suicide because he himself is the boy who could not grow up, whereas Peter Pan is the boy who would not grow up. Big difference. Barrie was sometimes referred to in his own lifetime as the boy who could not go up, somewhat scurrilously. I haven't seen The Lost Boys for 15 years. I think it was repeated in the early 90s, and I took a squint. And again, I tended to see the things that I had reservations about rather than what worked. But Ian's performance, I think, will always stand up. Nico rang me up after he saw it, and he was in tears, and in particular was, as he said, undone by seeing Ian become Uncle Jim. and you can't get a more complimentary than that.